Start. I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. We meet today on the lands of the Larrakia people, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and recognise their cultural and spiritual connections to Australia's lands and waters. I welcome representatives of the City of Darwin and the Northern Territory Electoral Commission. Thank you for appearing together today. For the benefit of Hansard, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
My name's Karen Parker. I'm from the Northern Territory Electoral Commission. I'm the Manager of Corporate Information and Training, and I'm here on behalf of the Electoral Commissioner, who extends her apologies, but we're a little bit too close to the election for her to attend.
Thank you.
Simone Saunders. I'm the Chief Executive at City of Darwin and representing the City and the Council as well. The Lord Mayor is unfortunately an apology for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Simone.
Scott Walker, Manager, Advocacy and Policy, City of Darwin, just observing today.
Thanks, Scott. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'm Kate Thwaites, I'm the Chair of the committee. This is my colleague Darren Chester. Do we have any members participating remotely?
Not as yet.
Okay, so it's us two at the moment. I'll hand over to you if you would like to make an opening statement, please.
Want to go first, Carol?
I do have an opening statement. Thank you. So the Northern Territory Electoral Commission wishes to thank the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters for the invitation to participate in today's hearing, and the Electoral Commissioner extends her apologies for not being able to attend today. My name is Karen Parker. I'm the Manager of Corporate Information and Training, and I was previously the Education and Engagement Coordinator for 7 years at the Commission. Prior to this, I worked for 8 years at the Parliamentary Education Services team at the Department of the Legislative Assembly, and I'm also a qualified and experienced classroom teacher. With this opening statement today, I'd like to focus on 3 areas. So the education programs that we currently provide, the remote engagement program that's currently running to promote the 2024 Territory election, and the communications approach to reach young people for this election. The Electoral Commission has a number of education programs targeting a range of audiences. For school students, we have a series of presentations that include a mock election, which are aligned to the Australian curriculum for civics and citizenship used in the Northern Territory. Any part of the curriculum that includes democracy or elections is addressed in our presentations. And we have separate presentations for years 3 to 4, years 5 to 6, years 7 and years 8 to 9. We also have a specialised presentation for legal studies students, as well as a more generalised future voters presentation targeted to students in years 10 to 12. We also have presentations tailored to Aboriginal students in remote schools where English is not the first language, and a similar program offered for adults for whom English is not a first language. Commission staff deliver all of these presentations on request. However, all of our education programs resources are available on our website, which means teachers can deliver the programs themselves. The Commission on request also conducts preferential elections for school captains, house captains and other school leadership positions where a voting centre is set up in schools. We found school elections to be an effective way to expose a large number of students to the voting process in a relevant context. The Commission has a strong working relationship with Parliamentary Education Services at the Department of the Legislative Assembly, and we offer a joint program for school and adult groups visiting Parliament House. The program includes a tour of Parliament House delivered by Parliamentary Education staff and one of the above-mentioned presentations delivered by Electoral Commission staff. These visits are coordinated by Parliamentary Education Services, and the Commission provides funding for bus transport for this joint program so that it's free for all participants. The joint program and funding arrangements have been in place for about 15 years. The Commission also runs a civics education initiative called Democracy Dash. This is a scavenger hunt type event where students dash around the city, visiting about 10 civic institutions to learn more about their work and therefore democracy. Some of the stops include Parliament House, the local council, court and legal aid. Democracy Dash has been running since 2017. And we now run about 5 or 6 events across Alice Springs and Darwin every year. That also includes free buses for the attending schools. So looking at our remote engagement program for the election, It's running over a 19-week period, and we're delivering a remote engagement program in over 70 remote communities in preparation for the election. 70, yeah, it's about 71, I think is the actual number. While in community, our teams check and update voter enrolments. We provide information about the election and voting processes. We're meeting with local organisations and stakeholders to seek their assistance engaging voters at election time when we return to the community. Consulting with the community members to improve the delivery of voting services, including the best location for voting centres and how best to communicate election information. And we also try and recruit local election assistants to work with the remote voting teams when they return, particularly for in-language support. In our communications campaign for the 2024 territory election, it includes the following activities aimed to reach young voters: advertising on social media platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram and TikTok. We're advertising on Spotify. We're advertising on TV streaming services like KO Sports and 9 Now. We're engaging with schools and youth organisations to distribute tailored communication resources. So we've got different stakeholder packs for different cohorts of voters, including young voters. We're attending youth events. We've got pop-up stalls at shopping centres on the weekends, and we're including young people in our advertising designs.
Thank you.
That's all.
Ms Saunders.
Thank you. Simone Saunders, the Chief Executive at the City of Darwin, and I think just to start more broadly, City of Darwin's circa 80,000 residents, so we're quite small in relation to a capital city. One of the things that we do find with Darwin is that we're not seeing a lot of population growth, but we also have a lot of transient population, so we have a high defence presence here, and then also that people may be coming up here for 3 years and then returning to other East Coast states. So what we see in the territory, and especially for the city of Darwin, is some of the lowest voter turnouts in the whole of Australia, and around, and it's different for obviously the Northern Territory elections versus the City of Darwin elections, but somewhere in those mid-60s is sort of what we're achieving from a voter turnout perspective versus, the 85% that you might see in a Brisbane environment. So for City of Darwin, there's a few things that we'd like to see, or, in relation to electoral participation. Our elections are run by the Electoral Commission. We don't do obviously the advertising and the promotion of it, but more broadly, because we've got such a transient population, they might not know, the history of the process, or might not, put their hand up for elections because they'll only be here for a short period of time. Therefore, I think it lends us to how do we get people that are long-term Territorians to stay in territory politics or enter territory politics. And I'll talk later about some of the potential impediments that we see, given such a small environment, and reputational issues with such a small environment, that our news circle is quite small. Therefore, news events, whether it be the Northern Territory Government or City of Darwin, one event can have quite a profound impact on a particular elected member or cohort. But in relation to electoral participation, the things that the Electoral Commission's just spoken about, really, explaining things in language. It seems to be, we have one First Nations elected official, Councillor Panqui, but we haven't seen a lot of candidates from the First Nations background, so definitely explaining in language and having a targeted campaign for First Nations people would be welcomed, and I know that you do it in Darwin to encourage that pool. But we don't have, from a youth civics participation, City of Darwin doesn't run a youth council or anything like that, so that's something we're definitely looking to do. But more broadly, it'd be welcomed if there was support over the whole of the Northern Territory for a youth council framework that we can all use consistently. Therefore, if somebody moves from, which sometimes happens, from Katherine to Darwin, or they're in Tennant or Alice and they move to Darwin, it's a similar process that they're used to through that. So anything in relation to funding and support for that, a formal framework, would be well welcomed. And then additional support of the programs that the Electoral Commission's currently running for school students to enable them to come in and participate more broadly in our council, and civics would also be welcomed. I'm not saying that the penalties are the only way to do this, but also we have a very low penalty for non-voter turnout for our City of Darwin elections in relation to, again, I'm going to say circa 150 in other jurisdictions, and we're sitting around that $25 mark. It used to be 50 and it was reduced, and so from a City of Darwin perspective, we would like to see that the Northern Territory Government consider increasing that penalty for non-voter turnout, because we don't believe for people that do have access to be able to postal vote or vote, we don't see it. $25 people sometimes don't bother in Darwin. And the other thing that potentially people still don't appear to know about in that electoral participation is the postal vote, and I know it is advertised, but the availability of that, and with whatever period the Electoral Commission advised that we can do that postal vote, still thinking they have to be there at that particular point in time. So that's probably, I guess, that electoral participation piece. The broader piece that I just started on is that we just see with such a small jurisdiction, the reputation of Council and the Northern Territory Government, it means that if there's any particular issue or concern, the social media and misinformation can perpetuate very, very quickly. We have different from a council perspective, we don't have the same independent code of conduct institutions that they do, say, in Queensland and Victoria. And I know the Northern Territory Government is doing some work in that space, but it is problematic where we have behaviours that are not conducive to good governance and civics, and they very quickly become big tarnish, I guess, what is a really, really great participation by the council members. So therefore, people wanting to enter local government here, and quality candidates who are interested, they're sometimes put off by the public and the media, and how quickly it will affect your family and your reputation here, which doesn't happen in larger jurisdictions, and it's becoming more and more prevalent, and we've seen it time and time again, the media driving with completely unsubstantiated things in that space. And we also think there's also a difference in how some of those broader defamation pieces run in the territory in comparison to interstate, or even using it, with social media, using a carrier service to menace and harass, which we don't see action in the territory due to limited resources. So we think there needs to be stronger focus and governance in that space as well. And that's for opening statement. That's probably everything just to cover. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you both. That's really helpful. Obviously, from our committee's point of view, we're really trying to explore what civics education looks like in really different contexts. So it's really useful for us to have that perspective, where people are getting their information from, and some of the challenges of engaging people in both civics and civics education, but also in electoral participation, and particularly people who do come from different backgrounds, and how we build that foundation so that people have that ongoing support of our democracy and our democratic institutions, and also feel that there's a point to participating in elections. So all the work you've brought to us is really relevant. Karen, I might start with you and some of the programs you're running. I was really interested to hear in your opening statement that you do work to support schools to run their own school elections, because in other hearings we've heard from young people that one of the things they find most dynamic when it comes to, okay, actually I do care about this and I want to be involved, is having had that school election process themselves. Can you tell me more about that program that you run?
Yes, so it's all on request, which is a shame. So once schools know about it, they do tend to come back again and again. So there's some schools that we've been running their elections for 7 or 8 years, because once we do it once, they're like, that's great, let's do it again. So, for example, it's mostly at primary schools, because they do have a big focus and they're happy for students to elect their school captains, school leaders. Once you get to middle schools and senior schools, sometimes the school wants to choose the right student. I have talked to principals before and told them that the kids normally get it right. If you set it up to show that this is serious, we're making a proper decision, here's a real voting centre with voting screens and ballot papers, the students won't pick the popular student, they'll pick the right student for the role. That does tend to happen. But we do it we do elections across senior schools, primary schools and middle schools here. Basically the schools, they run the nominations, so they'll collect the nominations, they give us student names and sometimes photos, because ballot papers in the Northern Territory have photos, so we try and make it look like the real thing, we replicate it as much as possible. And then we'll go into the schools, set up a voting centre. We're often there for the students giving their speeches on the stage in the assembly area, and then I'll go up on stage and give them voting instructions. And my two main instructions are, this is how you vote preferentially, we want your vote to count, and voting is secret. Don't tell your friends who you're voting for, it's not a group decision, it's your own individual decision. And then they go through the process of going to a voting screen, doing their preferential vote, putting it in a ballot box, and then we run the count at the school, usually with teachers helping us, and this is a great way to teach teachers how to do a preferential count because they've never seen it either, if they haven't been exposed to it. And so then we do the count and we give the results to the principal and we walk out and the school just thinks, wow, they just came in, it took an hour and we've got 2 school captains and the kids have all learnt the process. Always. And if a school says, oh, I'm not sure about running preferentially, trust us. We want to be running a preferential election. This is training for the students when they're adults, and they'll understand it if we set it up right and give the instructions.
Would be involved?
Number of schools is about 12 to 15. We're really only doing Darwin, Palmerston and the rural area because we don't have a presence in Alice Springs. We visit Alice Springs, but we'd love to be doing our school elections when we visit, and we'll get there, we're just not there yet. It's about 1,000 to 1,500 students that would go through a school election that we run each year. Sometimes schools run their own because there's teachers there who know how to do it and will just provide voting screens and ballot boxes. We've recently rebranded them, so we just leave them at the schools now, and they've been using them for a few years. So there are schools running elections that look a lot like ours, but we're not running them because they have the resources.
We heard a lot about attendance rates at schools being quite low in different jurisdictions. So is it a one-day voting process?
It is a one-day voting process.
There's no pre-poll opportunities?
It's not even a one day, it's a 10 minutes. The kids are there. We're there for an hour, but the kids are...
So decisions are made by the kids who turn up on that day?
Yes, correct.
Yep,
yeah.
Understood. Thank you.
To participate. And your point around engagement with primary schools also reflects evidence that we've heard from other people engaged in this space, that a lot of civics education seems to be focused at a primary school level and actually get quite good engagement from young people at that stage. Then when we come to the secondary years, in that lead up to young people actually going to be able to vote,
it drops off.
Yeah, and there's a gap in that period. So that reflects your experience.
It definitely does. And I remember when the Australian curriculum was brought in, because the Northern Territory took it up, and when the civics curriculum came in particular, and it was phased in and not every school picked it up straight away, but I definitely noticed over the phase-in, because I was at Parliamentary Education Services then, primary schools picked it up really quickly and were really good at including it into their curriculum. It's only 5 weeks, the civics part. Middle schools and senior schools were much slower at picking it up, and private schools were the slowest. And what I found talking to teachers there, because I deal a lot with legal studies teachers, so they'll get a student come in year 11, they haven't looked at civics since primary school, because their experience in the middle school was that they did 3 terms of history and a term of geography. And the only time civics came in was if they looked at federation as part of history or something like that. There wasn't a lot of the civics actual part of it. So the civics curriculum is quite good if you're actually implementing it into your curriculum at the school, and it took schools it took the middle schools and senior schools longer to do that, I found. They're doing it now, but we're about 10 years out from the curriculum coming in.
Is the Commission providing resources, or audiovisual resources, or whatever, for the teachers, or is it a curriculum set by the Education Department?
The curriculum's pretty open, that it even says in there, go and visit Parliament House, for example. So it'll tell you what external resources to look for. We don't provide them directly to the schools, but we provide the schools with information about what we can provide, but the information's on the website as well. So some teachers just go straight to our website, grab the PowerPoint, a ballot paper template and run it themselves, and some will contact us.
Sorry, one more, Chair. You mentioned presentations suitable to Indigenous students.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean? Is that in language, or is that
It's not in language.
Indigenous presenters, or what?
No, it's still us presenting, and we don't do as many of them as I would like, but just being an ESL teacher in the past, I used some of those ESL teaching techniques. So if I'm presenting to a Darwin school, it's a PowerPoint, I'm asking the students lots of questions, eliciting a lot of the answers from them, and pretty much speaking the whole time until we get to the mock election. If I'm in a remote school, I go through a couple of slides. It's a lot slower. I try and get some of the words from them, and then we do a hands-on activity. So they're not listening to English for 45 minutes like a Darwin school could. And their hands-on activities, for example, we look at the 3 levels of government, and I introduce them to the 3 levels of government, and then I give them a series of pictures on a screen, and they are then given the word. So, for example, we might have rubbish collection, and there's a picture of, rubbish bins and a rubbish, the trucks. You probably know what they're called, the rubbish trucks. So the students just have to match rubbish collection, the words, to the picture on the screen. And they can speak in language when they do it, and they would always have an assistant teacher when they do it, but it's a break from me talking to them with a hands-on activity. And then we do a few more slides, and then we do another hands-on activity, a couple more slides, and then a mock election. So it breaks up them having to hear it all in English the whole time.
Sorry, I do have one more, Chair. Do you find your local MPs, excuse me, and councillors are going to schools as well and doing classes? I mean, as a local MP in my electorate, I would probably visit 25 schools a year and do a conversation about government and how it all works.
I don't know how much they're in classrooms, but they're certainly at their schools as the local member because they attend assemblies. So our members, in Darwin at least, in remote it's totally different because they're so large and it's hard for them to get around. But for example, where my kids go to school, the local member is at every assembly every 2 weeks. So they see her, but she would only have 3 or 4 schools in her division.
But she wouldn't go in the classroom and talk about it.
I don't know how much they go into classrooms and whether that's part of it, but I know from the parliamentary end, if they're doing a role play in Parliament, they're invited to be part of that. They're invited to, if the kids go to Parliament House for an excursion, and that's quite a big program, and there's a lot of schools doing that. Even schools that come up to Darwin for camp will go to Parliament House as part of their visit, and their local members are always invited to meet with them. Sometimes they put on a morning tea with them, join the tour with them, have a question-answer session.
There'd be nothing to stop a local member accessing your resources, your PowerPoint, for example, and going into
and delivering it. No, it's on the website.
Yeah, okay.
I'd rather do it, but it makes me a little bit nervous. But no, there's nothing stopping them. Absolutely not. I'm not sure how much schools and teachers invite them in, or know that that's something that they could invite them in.
No, neither am I. I know that over in my own lecture I do a lot of it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether that's quite normal. Or...
We did get some correspondence from a school recently because a proposed candidate put one of their signs on a school fence, and they wrote to us and said, please take the sign down. And then they gave us a copy of a Department of Education policy that says schools are politically neutral, and then there's a whole separate policy around members in schools and what they can and can't do. So I don't know if that prohibits it. We didn't actually see that policy, but they mentioned that there is a policy about members and their participation in school activities.
Fair enough. Yeah, I might move on to remote engagement.
Sure.
You said you spend a 19-week period leading up to the...
Yeah, it started in April
remote,
and it finishes in a couple of weeks.
Okay, so does that involve multiple visits to communities, or what would that look like, that engagement?
So there's 3 teams. There's 2 for the top end and 1 for Central Australia, and those teams essentially spend 1 week out and then 1 week in the office booking and preparing the next week. And it's not revisiting communities, unfortunately. That's 70 separate communities that get 1 visit. But when you're there, that's why you're visiting the local organisations, stakeholders, the Aboriginal corporations in particular, the councils, local authorities. We've spoken at every local authority meeting, usually by teams, but because they're the people on the ground who champion it in the meantime before we can get back there with the voting team.
And those connections you build with local organisations, are they informal connections, or are you entering into partnerships or funding agreements with any of them? Yeah.
They're informal, but we capture them. So in our election management system, there's a lot of notes in there about people, their contacts, the organisations, what they've done in the past, what they've offered to do. Happy to send, put up posters. We make notes about all of those for every community in the system.
And do you share that with the AEC when they're doing their work to prepare?
On request, yeah, they've often asked us. My colleague who's been heading up the remote voting for a long time, he always gets phone calls from the AEC. Often gets requests, come and work with us for a few months, but we can never let him go because there's so many by-elections that he's always busy. But yes, he talks to the AEC a lot, sharing contacts and yeah.
Do you have any observations on differences between the way you would approach remote engagement from a NTEC perspective to the way the AEC approaches its engagement?
I'm not sure how they approach their engagement. At election time, they have a lot more funding so they can get to more communities than we can, and sometimes we hear about that at election time. It's also sometimes they use it, this is just anecdotally, I'm not in the remote space at the Electoral Commission, they'll use different locations sometimes, and so that can confuse the community members, which is why part of this program we ask them, where do you want us? What's the best place that the people will know and expect us to be? And it might be that we might have gone there last time, but there's been 2 federal elections in the meantime and they're used to a new spot now. So we always check that with the community.
Voter turnout between Northern Territory elections compared to federal elections is about the same?
For a federal election, I think at the last one that we had, I'm not sure about the referendum turnouts, but it's about 75%. And at our Legislative Assembly elections, it's about 75%. When you get to council, it definitely drops. The profile is lower. But it's about the same number of people turning out to one of ours, to one of theirs. It's just lower than everywhere else. But within that, our remote divisions drop a little. So our urban divisions can hit 80. I mean, I think Goyder, which is a Darwin rural area, was 87%. That was our highest turnout. And our lowest would have been one of the remote ones at about 55%.
Do you have a target figure?
We would like to hit 80% overall, and we'd like the remote divisions to be 70%.
Yep.
We don't hit it though.
Yep.
Maybe this one for 80. There's a lot of people interested in this, but I've got to say there's a lot of Territorians not in the Territory. They're all in Europe. So we've had a lot of phone calls. We're wondering what's they going to do to the turnout. But yeah.
Of course, it is the time of year. Although, you know, as people from Victoria, we're enjoying spending this time here in the Territory.
Yeah.
Simone, I was interested in what you were saying about looking to run a youth council and having a youth framework across the Territory as well, because again, what we've heard in evidence at previous hearings for this inquiry is that young people find these concepts most engaging when they have a sense of how it applies to them and how they can be involved. Is that where you're coming from in terms of wanting to do more of that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to what Karen said, that we find the same thing. We do get that interest from the primary schools, so they'll come in and visit chambers and come through the Civic Centre. Our Lord Mayor will go out and visit the schools. Obviously, there's no necessarily political issues with him going to visit. Generally, though, what we find when he goes and visits, he's in the story time space, or more broadly, not in the civic space. But then we do find that there's no engagement in that period. Let's just say from 12 to 17. We also have a youth account. We have a youth advisory committee, but their role is quite different to being potentially in that civics, civic space. So what we definitely like to see is assistance with a framework that's worked somewhere else in Australia potentially, and assistance with that rolled out more broadly. And we'd absolutely welcome that. I know elected members are keen to see that, and then so that's more formalised, and then we can go out to all the schools and get that participation and make it a more formal process. And that there's nothing to stop if we set that up as an advisory committee. There could be recommendations that come through in that really, critical use space that then flow into council. So they're actually part of, putting ideas into council as well through that process in the youth council. The other thing that, and I've got my City of Darwin hat on, but more broadly from a local government authority and TISO, a LEGAMP perspective, there's a great opportunity in the Territory. There's 17 local governments or local government authorities, and we do have some of majority of the remote ones are actually 80-90% First Nations on council. So therefore, it's a really good framework and structure that's already in place to get those civics through and to get kids participating in that. They've got regular council meetings. They're going to happen. So there's that structure there that means that potentially if for some reason they're not at school for 4 weeks, you can still get them formally into that system, and they've got great mentors that they can see in community that are doing that direct work. So I think would be really valuable. Yeah.
So there's an opportunity there more broadly with local council to engage young people through that space. I know,
absolutely.
We visited the school in Maningrida yesterday, and the kids had done their civics education, and when prompted they came up with the 3 levels of government, but definitely the level of government that you could tell they were most engaged with and that was relevant to them was obviously local government, where they could name the mayor and talk about that work. So,
I found that too when I've presented to remote schools and we look at the 3 levels of government. I always start with local, and I find like the photos specific to that community, who are your local members, they always know them. That's dad, that's granddad, that's uncle, they know them. And that actually is, I do it right at the beginning and it brings them in. That's how I've engaged them, because they know their local councillors. Yeah.
So on the question of the Youth Council though, you say more support. What are the barriers there? Is this something that ALGA, the Australian Local Government Association, should be providing a structure that has worked in other areas, or what are you looking for to help the council deliver it?
I think ALGA's got structures in place that might work really well, let's just say in Townsville, or, but the dynamic environment of the territory will be quite different, what we need in remote here. So potentially it's a conduit through Legant, as that they work on a framework that works for City of Darwin more broadly, and they, then it has a focus that extends more broadly out into the territory. The other impediment will be in that space will be funding to set up and structure those particular things. So where does the funding flow? If you're sitting in Maningrida, for instance, and you're already, from a service delivery perspective, there is not a really big rate space, so it's all going to be, direct funding majority that they're receiving. So how do you then run an additional council meeting, make sure you've got, bringing kids in, because they might not. So with, say, West Arnhem, for instance, it's a big remit. So how do you get those kids to travel? They're going to be able to travel, free buses, so there's going to be all those challenges for the kids to be able to participate. So therefore there's a structural element for municipals and then regional, and then there's also got to be a funding element that supports that. Otherwise, council between, do we want to pick up the rubbish or can we run this? They have to pick up the rubbish first, and that's where the
structure you're suggesting would be some level of Commonwealth funding direct to Northern Territory Local Government Association.
Yep.
To administer a locally specific, culturally appropriate.
Yeah, correct.
Territory approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be, be an appropriate channel for it to come through, and then the structures can be built to, like I said, from municipals and regional. There is the Barclay has a. Is it Barclay that has the Youth Council, or is it further down? Central Desert, maybe? Youth Council. There is one that does have a, I can find out for you and come back on that, but there is one that does have a Youth Council that they run. I think it might be Central. Yeah. Yep.
And to the points you were making about misinformation spreading and the impact that has on people wanting to participate and put their hands up. For election, certainly, again, part of what we're looking at is the environment of where people get their election information from, or more broadly, information about democracy from, and again, increasingly, obviously, especially for young people, that is from social media sources, as well as how well equipped people are to understand that all the information they come across on these sites may or may not be accurate. So we've heard the AEC runs a campaign to try and promote digital literacy around elections for people, not just for young people, but for people more broadly. We've heard from some other groups around targeted work for children that goes into media literacy for them as well. Do you think something like that would be helpful in the environment you're talking about, if people are given information about, hey, if you see something online, you can't just necessarily jump in and back that in. You need to stop and think about, is that information accurate, or is someone pushing an agenda?
Yeah, definitely. I think in that pre-education space, it would be helpful for more education in that regard. But maybe for, I can't speak, it's different for territory. But if people are looking to run for local government, that there is, and I know there is, you do run sort of provide the information, but there's a lot of written information again. So we have elected members that currently that English is not a first language and can't read what they've got in front of them. So even all the training then that comes with that, they didn't have initial literacy to be able to even understand. So I think that pre-education, piece can you understand what you're going to be doing, and this is what's you're going to need to be making decisions on before coming into council. I think that would be helpful, but probably the broader piece that I'm talking about is that, again, because it's such a small pool, that the how we, I guess, obviously freedom of speech, that's not what we're talking about, but how do we avoid where we've got repeated defamation of, whether it be public officers or councillors, where it's targeted to your family, and it happens here because it's very, where you walk, Lord Mayor, everybody would see him. It's same for anybody that's in NT politics. So how do we protect, from a legislative perspective, that space in the territory? I think becomes more and more important, because a couple of people that potentially haven't got best intentions or don't understand the roles of governance and civics and things like that have that real ability to cause significant damage to the reputation of local government across the territory, and we're seeing that at the moment. We've got 2 councils under management, so the councils have been dismissed. One actually happened 2 days ago, and that's sort of reputational damage, and even structures as simple as that. Let's just say we've got a council of 9, you might have had 2 problematic councillors, I'm just generalising, but the whole council's been dismissed. So all those people, reputation in a tiny town, their whole reputation's been tarnished. So it's those sort of decisions where potentially, from a Northern Territory government perspective, how do we get better structures in place in the NT that the minister could stand one person down if they're the problematic and not tarnish the whole reputation? Because Tennant Creek, for instance, you'll go back to elect a new council soon in Tennant, and dare say a lot of those people that are doing it, almost volunteer time, they might not ever put their hand up again, because the reputational damage and the whole piece that they've already been through is problematic. The other thing on legislative perspective, which we would like to see change, and I'm not sure whether Karen supports this, but we have a lot of by-elections here, and our Local Government Act requires, even if we've just had an election, and so if a candidate, after they've been appointed as candidate, if they resign a week later, it triggers a by-election rather than going back to the counts. So we don't even have a system where within 3 months we can go back to the counts. So that's $100,000 cost to City of Darwin. Again, a by-election, and for participation for this same cohort of people. So I think there needs to be some considerations of how do we potentially, especially in smaller communities, get a panel of people that are interested, and if you've got good candidates, what period of time, if they're still interested, is it 6 months, is it 9 months, where they can actually we don't have to hold a by-election, we can just go back and have a look at those candidates. So a lot of that additional work that the community gets involved in, and if you've had 6 by-elections, people are like, can't do any more. Yeah, so I think that's too. Yeah,
and especially for regional councils. I mean, they have smaller number of constituents, so it's not as expensive as the City of Darwin one, but they can't afford them either.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of by-elections. I mean, East Arnhem Regional Council, I think we've run 6 or 7 in a 2-year period. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot. Yeah. So, yeah.
We have actually just researched what happens in other jurisdictions, and I know in New South Wales they have a count-back system, but it's a choice for the council. They can either opt to go into that. It's one of the decisions they make after being newly elected. What are going to be our methods of re-election if something happens within this period? Yeah. So we're doing our research, but yeah, it would require legislative change.
Just a little bit, a little bit more on the misinformation risks. I know the AEC in the last election spent a lot of time debunking online, mainly through social media channels. Obviously not getting any partisan way, just purely on the facts that were being spread. Misinformation was being spread, sorry. Is that a role for the Northern Territory Electoral Commission? Do you have to find yourself having to do that, or does the City of Darwin have to fact check, keeping in mind obviously the freedom of speech issues you raised, but just the complete rubbish out there? Is that you're actively engaged debunking that, or whose role?
For this current election, 2024, it's our first time we've had a misinformation and disinformation register, where there are, we've actually put up a few examples, and we've invited the public if you hear anything. We haven't actually received anything from the public, and it's not as bad here as it is in other jurisdictions. We will have one for the local government elections next year, and that will be our first one again. But we've gotten legal advice about this, and ours is very much if it's to do with the election process. So if there's a myth out there that you only have to vote one and it's a full preferential election, then we would put that on the misinformation, disinformation. If it's just slander against a particular candidate, that wouldn't go on the register. And that's kind of on the candidate. We don't have anything.
Powers go to information about the running of.
And of course, and that's only at election time that we have that register outside. So now if there's something happening with the council, we don't have any kind of misinformation or disinformation campaign or information on our resources.
And from a council perspective, if we've got any misinformation, disinformation, we would pass it over to the Electoral Commission. And previously, then I didn't know that. I assumed it went into a register, but that's good to know that next year we'll have a formal one. But
it wasn't one. This is our first one.
I know that's but we always pass it over. But as far as council being in that space, staying apolitical, especially in relation to Northern Territory government elections, but even in relation to our own, we'll make sure that our libraries have the factual information from the Electoral Commission, and we distribute that, but no other kind of information do we sort of get ourselves involved in that space. So we're not seen to be potentially politically biasing one group or another. Yeah.
And just in terms of the integrity, I guess, of the electoral roll, given the transient nature of your workforce and being a defence town, is there any research or any indication whether people who are based up here for a couple of years change their enrolment details?
The FDEU process through the AEC captures most of it now. It didn't always, but yeah, it does capture it now. Defence, we deliberately attend. There's welcome to new defence personnel and their families that come up. It's an expo that happens in both Katherine for the Tyndall base and up here, and we attend both of those with a really strong enrolment focus. Hey, you've just moved up, you can update your enrolment right now, so we have a laptop there ready for them to do it. So we attend those. But defence is, anecdotally, we had a Lions by-election which covers the ward of the CBD, and there are a lot of defence personnel that actually live here. We got the word out, so we liaised with Defence and let us know if any of them are not here because they're out doing exercises or they're not here, so they're unable to vote. We can provide an excuse, or we can provide postal votes to where they are. So they gave us a list of names, and 50% of them weren't enrolled in that ward. So,
and anecdotally, it suggests a lot of the married, unaccompanied would keep a footprint in wherever their spouse is living, and may not even change their enrolment details if they're living here for 3 years.
Yeah, potentially. And a lot of them come here first and they'll stay at the barracks, and then they get enrolled there, and then they move on, but their enrolment is still there.
Okay.
Yeah, which is not the Lions ward, but we found a lot of names were still enrolled there, but they'd moved to the city and should have had their enrolment.
Okay, this is sort of leading up to the question, Simone, around if they're not engaged because they're moving through from a civics and citizenship perspective, do they feel like, is there a voter apathy? They feel like this is just not important to them. I'm not going to be here very long. I don't care what you do with the roads or the playgrounds or whatever it might be. Is that an apathy? Can you measure that, or is that an attitude that's out there? Or?
And again, this would be anecdotal, but that would be my view that it is. There's an apathy if people are here for only a short period of time, 12 months, 18 months, as far as probably more in that local government space, as far as not going to be here to see what happens with a playground or a pool or those longer term pieces. I think from an enrolment perspective, I think the new system where when you're coming in to vote you can get enrolled at the same time has been really good as opposed to the prior system. But I just think a lot of people just choose not to vote, and again in general cohorts, so it's $25. It's not even worth doing the postal vote. And these are people who are actively engaged in civics and those sort of things. So that in the territory, especially in that local government space, which is disappointing. Yeah.
How actively do you pursue the $25 fine?
So that's an interesting piece, and it's a piece between Electoral Commission. So. The City of Darwin doesn't set the fee, that's set by the Northern Territory Government. And then when it used to be $50, the Electoral Commission then goes about recovery, but then the cost of recovery is charged back to us. So what we said recently to the Electoral Commission, we're not paying your recovery fees. So we've had this piece, so Electoral Commission's out of pocket, and we can't control what the fee is, which then doesn't even cover the cost for the Electoral Commission to recover.
You lose money pursuing.
Exactly. So therefore, there's no pursuing of fines because the Northern Territory Government set the fee so low, and we're kind of Electoral Commission and City of Darwin stuck in this space. Whereas if it was up at $100 $150, people that have the means to be able to vote, understand civics, will continue to, I think vote to avoid the $150 fine, and then at least you have a smaller cohort that you can work with. What are the challenges and impediments, and work with them to voting, and why couldn't you vote? Is it you don't understand? And then you'd get a better, I think, a smaller group that you could work with. I think, yeah.
Parking fines higher than your failure to vote.
Beg your pardon?
Are parking fines higher than failure to vote?
Yes, absolutely.
So what's the parking fine?
Parking fines either $40 or $50. Yeah, depending where you are. So, yeah.
It's a little bit of a funny story, but very quickly, it used to be that the Legislative Assembly election fine was $25 and council was $50, and we had made the recommendation, as had others, that they should be harmonised. We're trying to harmonise the two acts because the local government elections are covered in the Local Government Act, and so we recommended that it be harmonised, and it was harmonised, but they harmonised it the wrong way. So it was brought down to 25 instead of LA being brought up to 50.
Going back a few points where you're talking about some improvements where people can enrol and vote on the day. Is that correct? So people can enrol and cast a declaration vote on the day? Is that
correct?
How it works?
Yeah, so our message is to, this was brought in 2019, so we first had it at the 2020 election, and it's certainly been in place now for this one. The message is to just turn up, and this was brought in particular for remote areas where the accuracy of the roll was a huge issue. It has improved because the FDU has expanded a lot. But yes, it essentially means if you're not on the roll, you cast a declaration vote. On the Monday after election day, we send all of those to the AEC for processing. It's processed within a few days. By the first Friday, so a week into the count period, we're admitting declaration votes if we found that they are now on the roll because they've been processed in the last few days. And so the final day of the count, they are enrolled people whose vote has counted at that election. It used to be that they were enrolled, but their vote didn't count because at the time that they voted, they weren't eligible, but we counted.
Do you have data that you could supply us on
Yes.
what that looked like at the last election?
Yep.
Thank you.
Sorry, are you?
Nope, done.
We'll just keep on going all day. Some of what you described, Karen, with the democracy, was it the democracy dash?
Yes.
Is very much like the US style of get out the vote campaigns, where obviously optional voting, they'll run rock concerts, they'll do events to try and get young people motivated to get out the vote.
Yeah, right.
What's brought that on? I mean, is it
the idea actually came, so it's my baby, but the idea came when I was still at Parliamentary Education Services, but you're so busy there that there wasn't really enough time to bring in a new initiative, but the request had come from Year 12 legal studies teachers who had said so much of this course is based in the text, it's an examinable one, so it's just straight from the text, it's so much work in the classroom, and yet the topic is all about the real world out there. So they do an excursion to the court, but not much else within that year. And she said in Year 11 there's a bit more flexibility. She said, I want something for Year 12 students to be able to get out there, taste the real world, see something real life about what they're getting from a text. So that's where the idea came from. So Democracy Dash, which I didn't put in here, is targeted to students in Years 9, 10, 11 and 12. So it's for senior students. So that was the spark. It was to get the older students out of the classroom and learning in real life. So they actually go to...
A bit of a scavenger hunt you described. They actually go somewhere and get information.
Yeah, they get a booklet at the start with a map and they get a number of stops. They actually go to the council and go to the chambers and do an activity in the chamber. Then they go to legal aid, which is just down the road, and they get interviewed like they've just been charged with driving without a licence. And they have a lawyer interview them, and then they go to court and they actually watch a bit of local court, and then they go to the Anti-Discrimination Commission and do a session with them. They come and do a preferential count with votes with us. So yeah, it's a scavenger hunt where they just visit. Luckily for us, we're all in the CBD here, it's all walking distance. And if you're not walking distance, we hire a room for you somewhere, sometimes in the library at the council or in Parliament House somewhere. So it's all walking distance, and they just visit about 10 different stops, all to do with democracy and civics. Yeah, it gets really good feedback that the students like learning outside the classroom. When we go to Alice Springs, ironically, the police are involved in our Alice Springs program, and they breathalyse and fingerprint the kids, and it is the #1. They absolutely love it. They love watching Court Live, and they love being fingerprinted and breathalysed. I know, it's an irony, it's very interesting.
Record's not being kept, I'm assuming.
For legal studies students, the comments that we've gotten from them is they're exposed what you can do with a law degree. Oh, I didn't realise you could then work in anti-discrimination. Or they go to the Office of the Children's Commission and talk about human rights and rights of the child and the exposure that it gives them. Oh, I didn't realise you could do so much in the space of law. Yeah, it's one of the feedback.
So, and just on trend lines, I know the federal election, I pretty much assume it's the same in the Northern Territory. There's never been more opportunities to vote in terms of postal, absentee, pre-poll, mobile voting centres. What are you seeing in terms of trend lines? Are you seeing better turnout, or are we flatlining? Or
It's changing. It's interesting. When early voting first came in, and in the Northern Territory it's open to everyone, there's no criteria for early voting, anyone can do it. There was this huge spike in early voting, and we got to a council by-election, I think it was the City of Palmerston, over 50% of the voters voted early. Since then, it seems to have dropped a bit, and we've got more, since COVID is what it was. Since COVID, more people are turning out on election day, and not so many people are voting early. It dropped to about 30% for the last few by-elections. So it'll be interesting to see in this election what the early voting trend is. But as for our general voting trends, it doesn't fluctuate very. It's increasing, but in small amounts.
so all these extra options of 2 to 3 weeks of pre-poll,
But 2 weeks of early voting, yes.
Absentee, postal, all these options,
Yes.
hasn't moved the needle on total voter turnout.
Early voting did a little bit, but not as much as you would have liked or would have expected. Yeah.
Right, well, thank you all for your attendance today and for sharing this information with the committee. If you have been asked to provide any additional information, we'd appreciate you getting that to the Secretariat by Friday, the 2nd of August 2024. Thank you all.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having us in town. Thanks for having us in town.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Beautiful weather.
The waterfront's really good. You've done a great job down there.
Technically, it's part of us, but it's a separate private authority organisation. No, I know, but it's one of those because if Northern Territory, it's technically Northern Territory government.
And they can't vote for City of Darwin.
So they don't vote in City of Darwin. They have their own. They're a separate rateable area. So it's a bit. They'd love to be part of City of Darwin, but
Well, it's a great precinct to link into what you've got on the waterfront now.
That whole precinct's amazing. So
People out walking every morning.
yeah.
Well done.
No, that's right. You missed last week with Pitch Black. It was pretty good here. We had the military exercise as well. It was pretty good. Yeah.
We had a bit of our own Top Gun moment at the airport yesterday, watching fast jets taking off.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, no.
And delayed going out and getting in.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you so much.
If you're ever in Canberra tonight, give us a yell.
Yeah, no,
Excellent. I might take a bathroom break.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. If you need outside. There's baked goods as well. I now welcome representatives of the Northern Land Council and the Central Land Council. Thank you for appearing together today. For the benefit of Hansard, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
Christine Williamson. I'm here representing Central Land Council as a senior policy officer.
My name's David Astelosh, representing the Northern Land Council. I'm our interim General Manager for Governance, Strategy and Communications.
Thank you both. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Would either of you like to make a short opening statement?
Short, but
Please, we'll make an opening
Well,
statement. We've got time.
we're all right.
Yeah.
Thank you. We welcome the opportunity to have input into the civics education inquiry. Just to acknowledge we're in Larrakia country and acknowledge all the lands on which CLC and NLC operate. This inquiry provides an opportunity for us all to have a better understanding of the systems changes required to ensure Aboriginal people have every opportunity possible to participate in civics, education and political life. At the heart of this inquiry is the need to recognise people's right to self-determination. Self-determination is a human right, as is participation in political life and the ability to form freedom of thought and conscience. These are founding principles upon which our universal human rights are built. These are rights, however, that many of us take for granted. In 2024, it's incomprehensible that the ability to exercise these rights can remain out of reach for so many people. We acknowledge that people are still grieving from the outcome of the referendum in 2023. This was a huge disappointment. People's willingness to participate in civics education and political processes has been challenged by this experience. Our constituents are continually disappointed and frustrated with this system that is not designed to enable and proactively engage them, noting that the anti-intervention is still fresh in people's minds and experiences. This, alongside many other experiences such as the dismantling of the community councils and introduction of super shires, has had a profound impact on the level of trust and confidence in people feeling that their voices are being heard and acted upon. Whilst we know that civics education is mandated within the Australian curriculum, what is not so clear is which agency is primarily responsible for the delivery of that and for ensuring that children and young people are provided opportunities to engage with current civics education program. And what does this access and participation look like? Like many other scenarios, we suspect that the reality between the intention of the curriculum and what is experienced on the ground is quite different. We know that there is a considered approach, when there is a considered approach to support remote communities to learn and engage with civics education, political processes and community engagement activities, voting turnout is higher. Some examples of that include where studies have drawn a correlation between when the federal government abolished the Aboriginal Electoral Engagement Program in 1996 and a steady decline occurring in voter turnout in remote communities from that point in time. Another example is when ATSIC undertook their 2002 elections. They ran an education campaign in parallel with that called The Right to be Heard, and voter turnout in Central Australia increased by 11.1%. CLC also ran education and advocacy campaign regarding the 2023 Voice referendum, and voter turnout improved to 73% compared to 66.8% at the 2022 federal election. So we know that when those things are run in parallel, an education campaign, voter turnout increases. We're pleased to note that the NT Electoral Commission will be reopening their Alice Springs office on the 29th of July this year. It's also reassuring to note their commitment to producing online resources in Aboriginal people's first languages. It's an important step in a range of measures that are needed to be pursued to enhance engagement with these processes. We'd also like to acknowledge the efforts of the Legislative Assembly of the NT to engage with young people about civics education. Given their limited resourcing, it seems that they've been very resourceful in working in partnership with other organisations such as the Michael Long Learning and Leadership Centre to engage remote students. I was listening before just to add in that a lot of those options and programs sound really amazing, but they're often not available to remote students. Our focus for this inquiry is on the experiences of Aboriginal people in remote communities within the Central Land Council region. These experiences provide valuable insights for the panel to consider. We also draw your attention to the structural issues that contribute to people's lack of understanding and participation in these processes, including the lack of continuity of education within remote communities for Aboriginal students. For example, the lack of secondary schooling available for students who live remotely. This creates a gap in civics education at a crucial time in young people's life. So I think around a third of remote communities have access to secondary school options. And I think you referenced before the low attendance rates. And the average attendance rate for Aboriginal students is 53%, and then when you get very remote, it drops down to 43%. So, and that's of those who are enrolled. So there are quite a few students who aren't enrolled or who fall through the gaps. There's significant challenges with the education system regarding the attendance and appropriateness of curriculum. There's significant gaps in students' development and educational outcomes from preschool through to higher education. There are language barriers that are exacerbated by the lack of access to bilingual education. The digital divide does not provide equity of access to internet, so all of those digital resources referring to in the previous session, they're great, but they're often not accessible for people. It hampers people's ability to access those digital resources, such as the ones developed by NTEC. But it also poses really serious challenges for people getting identification. So identification leading to, the ability to vote and all sorts of other things. It's important to note historical experiences of people's interactions with governments that have created an environment of mistrust. And this has to be taken into consideration in the development of engagement strategies by governments. The cost of living pressures hinder participation. So where transport to other communities or regional centres are required to vote, particularly in the context of really short windows of opportunity to vote out bush, that can be a hindrance to people participating. Inadequate resourcing of NTEC and AEC to undertake a sustained commitment to engage with Aboriginal community partners. No system for automatic enrolment, which is available to people in urban areas when they enrol in Centrelink. And lastly, the perverse...
FDU is working remotely.
Is it? Okay, so is that a new...
Within the last couple of years,
yeah.
But it is in place, and it's what has been... I guess what the AEC is attributing the increase in enrolment, particularly from remote and regional investment.
That requires them to be out in the community?
No, this is the FDAU, the direct enrolment that you
were
talking about.
Great. And perverse approaches from the NTC to voter access, whereby small voter turnout in a community results in a smaller window to vote offered at the subsequent NT election, rather than investing more resources into ensuring residents are motivated to vote. The period of time the polling booth is open in that community is cut back. So we understand that where enrolment's increasing, that's where NTC or AEC will put more time in with polling booths, not where enrolments are low or dropping, where we think that's where the effort should be put in. They're not, a lot of these aren't new insights. A lot of them are identified under Closing the Gap National Agreement, which all governments are signatories to. We wish to reiterate, I guess, that the NT poses some pretty unique challenges, particularly for remote communities. Some of this is about distance, linguistic diversity, the pretty dire situation around education, our education system having the worst attendance and outcome rates in the country. Lack of access to adequate housing, the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people incarcerated, and low voter turnout. All of these things create an environment in which people find it difficult or, for whatever reason can't participate. If we're genuine about having people's voices heard, then we must take a holistic approach to addressing the system problems, not just focus on individuals. There exists a role for government to work alongside land councils and other Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to support civics education, but also to work in genuine partnership that fosters shared decision-making as per the government's commitment to closing the gap. So business as usual has to change in order for us to expect different outcome. Thank you. Thanks for...
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, I just pass on my apologies from the Northern Land Council Chair, Matthew Ryan, who unfortunately is unable to be here today with a late scheduling clash. He was excited to hear that you were going out to his community where he lives in Nanangreta yesterday, and we'll be keen to hear the results of how that went. It is quite a lengthy statement, but I'll go through it on his behalf, if that's all right. Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Larrakia people. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. As Chair of the Northern Land Council, I am honoured to have this statement shared at the public hearing on the inquiry into civics, education, engagement and participation in Australia. This inquiry, adopted by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, looks to address an issue that is critical to the fabric of our democracy and, in particular, the self-determination of Indigenous Australians. Civics education is a key part of any informed and active community. It is important that all Australians, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, have access to strong education that empowers them to understand their rights and responsibilities and to participate in democratic processes. In October 2022, the NLC provided a submission to the Joint Committee on Electoral Matters inquiry into the 2022 federal election. Focusing on remote Aboriginal communities, it offered 8 recommendations, which were reiterated at a roundtable discussion in November 2023. As we approach the 2024 territory election, several of those recommendations have been in part or wholly actioned, with learnings taken from election challenges at both federal and territory levels. In stark contrast to every other Australian jurisdiction, the majority of Aboriginal people in the NT live in remote or very remote areas. In the electorate of Lingiari, for example, research from the ANU estimates that around only half eligible Aboriginal people in this electorate have been voting. Beginning in April 2024, a remote engagement and education program has been delivered by the NTEC to 71 communities across the territory. Additionally, the AEC's Federal Direct Enrolment and Update process continued, whereby people have been automatically enrolled to vote as part of processes like engaging with Centrelink, motor vehicle registries, or through the tax office. NTEC have confirmed people will be able to vote in any community where there is a polling booth, with many regional centres also opening from Monday, August the 12th, weeks prior to the election day. Alternatively, people can apply online to organise a postal vote. The NTEC have also followed the direction of community leaders to engage local assistants with language skills in all locations where possible. These assistants have supported pre-election communications and will be supporting voters on election day. This is all positive. However, there are improvements that can and must continue in relation to greater resourcing for youth education and in line with additional NLC recommendations, including that the AEC amend the Commonwealth Electoral Act to enable eligible unenrolled voters to be enrolled and to have their votes admitted during the scrutiny process, which have been allowed in the Northern Territory since 2020, as well as both the AEC and NTEC considering the introduction of optional preferential voting and removing any remaining restrictions on prisoners voting. I want to talk a little bit more about a couple of the key challenges. First of all, repair and trust building. For many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, the journey to civic engagement has been marked by painful history and ongoing barriers. These include, of course, dispossession and assimilation, as well as disparities in education, access to information, and representation. It is crucial that any discussion about civics education in Australia includes a focus on how we can better support and engage Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. From conversations with Indigenous Territorians and the insights raised by our Council, it is clear that countrymen are sick of empty promises from politicians. Following on from the Voice referendum, there is still pain and a lack of trust, and a hesitancy to engage in politics at all. Aboriginal people are questioning, does this process speak for me? Do these people speak for me? Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to be supported to feel like they are taking part in matters that it is valuable and that it's empowering to engage in this process. In 2021, so the chairperson, was one of 2 NLC constituents that lodged a complaint to the Australian Human Rights Commission, saying the AEC's federal direct enrolment update process suppressed or inhibited Aboriginal people in remote communities and thereby amounted to discrimination. Following the FDEU trial across 63 remote sites in the NT, Western Australia and Queensland, that was welcome, albeit limited. Speaking to the NTEC recently, I'm encouraged to see direct enrolment efforts expanded to now include notifications that are being sent out to community mailbags and email addresses. However, the NLC continues to have concerns around the communication of direct enrolment. For example, letters that get sent to a community mailbag may be returned to sender if the intended recipient fails to collect them promptly, and that the person may not be adequately informed of their enrolment. There must also be protections put in place to ensure fines are not applied to community members who, through no fault of their own, are not informed and then punished for failing to vote. Troublingly, there continues to be a lot of confusion surrounding elections, electorates, candidates, and how democracy functions in general. Education is key to improving this. The NLC would like to see more information about democracy being taught in schools, and for this to be done in a culturally appropriate way, not just having a one-sided Western view. First, there needs to be an understanding that any discussion of Australian democracy can bring up painful trauma for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We also need to acknowledge the strength of Indigenous leadership and cultural frameworks that have existed in harmony on this continent for 65,000 years. In rolling out culturally aware programs that explain the rationale and processes of democratic elections to young people, we need to ensure that the standards of education is equal across both urban and remote areas, and to Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Beyond schools, it's important to simultaneously recognise the effects of the long-term under-provision of electoral education and information to remote communities. Anecdotal reports indicate that there are generations of community members who have never received adequate or any electoral or civic education services. This has not been due to a lack of interest. Research into electoral engagement and education in 3 remote communities in the NLC's region, undertaken by Charles Darwin University, found that a good majority of those interviewed see participation in the electoral processes as an important aspect of being an Aboriginal Australian. The research also noted that voters' concerns around how to better understand the purpose of voting, the underneath stories of parties and policies, and how to effectively judge the achievements of the past or incumbent politicians. They emerged as just as significant as concerns around literacy and numeracy at the ballot box. Close attention should be paid by continuing to strengthen partnerships with local organisations that can act as cultural brokers and provide appropriate and informed assistance. Further research from Charles Darwin University found that what was considered good electoral engagement varied slightly in each community, but consistently included the involvement of local people and local solutions. Notably, there was reference to including senior people engaged on the basis of their cultural authority and their ability to work across and through different governance traditions in engaging community members around electoral participation and voting. It's important that communications material be culturally appropriate and designed to meet the needs of remote communities in the NT, where English is often a second, third, or sixth language, and literacy levels may be lower than in urban areas. Consideration should be given to presenting information in alternative formats, such as visual or oral representation. The NLC has found our own visual communications about elections in our Land Rights News newspaper, and especially video on social media platforms to be most effective. Notably, the NLC Sign Up to Stand Up campaign that featured well-known and trusted Indigenous personalities, including Charlie King, Esther Bulumbara, Theresa Rowe, Constantina Bush, and Kamahi Jordan King. Today we have the opportunity to hear from a diverse group of people who will provide more valuable insights into the current state of civics education and civics engagement in Australia. If we listen fully and we listen deeply, These perspectives will help us identify the gaps and opportunities for improvement. I'd like to thank the Standing Committee on Electoral Matters for undertaking this important inquiry. Your commitment to improving civics education and participation is essential for the health of our communities and country. As we proceed with today's hearing, I encourage all participants to consider the unique challenges and opportunities faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in terms of civics education. Let's work together to create a more inclusive system. Elections are the backbone of our Australian democracy, and we must ensure everyone can participate equally.
Thank you both. And certainly, yes, we are really pleased that we've been able to both visit Managrita yesterday, but also be here today, and absolutely acknowledge what you've both said about the unique challenges that people, particularly in remote communities in the NT, face when it comes to civics education and participation in elections. So it's really great to have your input and for us to be here today. I might start on how the AEC engages with people in remote communities around polling. So as you're probably aware, the AEC has what they call the Indigenous Electoral Participation Program, which is where they do work with community-based organisations to support electoral participation at a local level. I'd be interested if either of you have experience of that program or reflections on that program, what might be working around it and what could be better about it.
I don't have any first-hand experience as such, but I do know that within the southern part of our region, MPY Women's Council were engaged through the AEC on that program. There were some other Aboriginal organisations also engaged, but ended up handing the money back, from what I understand, because I think they were limited in terms of the amount of advocacy that could be done back to things needing to change.
Advocacy back to the AEC?
Yeah, I believe it was somewhat limited in terms of what could be done. My understanding from the NPY Women's Council scenario is that they took a community development approach. So they engaged local Anangu researchers who had knowledge or gained knowledge of civics and political processes, and were also able to translate on the spot. Some of the benefit of that, engaging local people, was also that people knew each other. So there was far less shame and stigma in coming up and saying, I don't know what this is about, can you tell me? So there was a lot more opportunity to engage people in a different way. I think they were quite flexible in how they delivered it. So they set out front of the store instead of setting up somewhere else. For people when it was really hot, or for people with disabilities, they were able to go to them in the car, you know, and so just flexible in terms of changing it up. When they were engaging local people, there are some other challenges outside of that, like reliability of car or other things, and they were able to sort of support people to have those challenges get dealt with really quickly and then continue the participation. I understand it was quite a good program. They got good voter turnout. Some of their insights they had is that the online enrolment posed some significant challenges in terms of people not having ID. So they mostly resorted to the paper forms. One of the benefits of having local researchers and translators and the trust and relationship with the community is that the people who were there on behalf of Women's Council were able to vouch for people to sign up for otherwise they would have had to spend a lot of time getting out and about trying to find someone who was on the electoral roll, who knew them, who could vouch for them. I'll just have a quick look at my notes because I had some stuff here that Maggie... I think internet access was really hit and miss, so they often had to revert to the paper forms, hence that digital divide issue as well. And there was often declaration voting, is that what they referred to it before, was needed, but anecdotally a lot of the feedback was that people weren't offered that as an option, not by Women's Council.
It's you can do
okay, right, yeah,
so it's not legal.
Yeah, okay, so their general experience was there wasn't any other option offered. So that makes sense why. Yeah, and I think that it just promotes better engagement all round when there's translators, when there's adequate time in the community. So when they went out, they spent 3 days in the community, not an hour or two. And that made a big difference, because when people knew you were there, they might come the next day. They might think about what they want to talk about and come the next day. So that adequate time, the translation, the ability to provide people with information on the spot, because that translation's available, and the ability to be flexible to meet community demands. So if there's a funeral in a nearby community, a lot of people have gone that way, then the adequate time allows for them to come back, or, you know, to change it up a bit. So it's...
Just clarifying on the direct enrolment, I understood that was rolling out more extensively. So would we expect in future elections there will be a greater enrolment, or what's the feedback from or is it proving difficult in remote communities?
I don't think I can speak to that one.
Okay.
We've had evidence from the AEC on that previously, and it goes to some of what David was talking about in his sub as well, that they have expanded the use of FDEU to remote communities, which hasn't been done previously. So we have seen an increase in enrolment, not necessarily an increase in participation as a result of the increases in...
I think that's the challenge. It's fine to enrol everybody, but then come election time, again, do people know that they're enrolled?
Well, that was someone,
do they, yeah.
That was some, the evidence yesterday and your evidence today that people shouldn't be fined in a circumstance where, through no fault of their own, they haven't actually voted.
Yeah.
So there was some criticism yesterday about people being enrolled and then at the risk of being fined if they didn't even know they'd been enrolled, or didn't know what their responsibilities were.
We had one of the one of the Australian Electoral Commission's education teams attended our full council meeting at the Gama site in Gulkula a couple of weeks ago, and they fielded questions from our members about that, about it's all well and good for people to enrol, but and be enrolled on their behalf, but their concern was, if I'm unable to vote, I don't know that I can vote, I'm in a location that makes it very difficult for me to vote, and voting's not offered where I am, then will I be fined? How do I get myself off the roll in a situation where I know that it's going to happen? Now, the AEC provided that information that there's only a couple of ways to get off the roll, and that's neither of which are available to people for those reasons.
It probably matters we can follow the AEC back in Canberra.
Out of the last couple of elections we've had, including referendum, have you had reports of people being fined who were unaware they'd been placed on the...
People are concerned about it from an AEC level. My understanding is the Territory doesn't pursue those fines in remote communities. But I think one of the main things that would assist us, not directly to your question, but just consistency between the acts. Obviously, they're different electoral structures and situations, but similar to what you heard from NTEC and City of Darwin before, with the message of turn up, because then you can be enrolled through a declaration process, or you may be on the roll through the direct enrolment process and not know about it. But I feel like what we have heard is that there is a bit of shame involved if people don't want to turn up and then be turned away.
Did you have any experience of the Indigenous electoral participation program that you wanted to add to?
No, not that program specifically, just we would echo the comments made by CLC, that when teams are in community, that it's not good enough to turn up for the occasional day or a couple of hours. They really need to invest the time in each of those communities equally to improve education and awareness of what is happening. And we'd also echo any program that engages local leaders on the ground to be a voice to explain why this is a good process and why you should be involved.
Can you expand, David, a little bit on your local people and local solutions? Because you gave an example of what has worked, your campaign with trusted community figures.
Yeah.
To me, that's almost more of an informal civics education. You're filling a gap there that perhaps mainstream education hasn't achieved.
Yep.
Is that something your council sees as a priority, or something you put more resources into in the future?
Yeah, it's something that we've done from time to time. So we had a big push with that 2022 election. The land councils are established under the Land Rights Act to acquire and manage Aboriginal land on behalf of traditional owners, working with traditional owners. So it's not one of our main statutory functions. But when we hear from our council that they're not being represented in Parliament or they want their voices heard better, then that's when the Land Council mobilises those kind of awareness campaigns. We basically pulled in those 4 or 5 spokespeople who are well known in communities to get that message out. That the
And that message was enrol so you have your say, not enrol and vote for X candidate.
Correct. It was enrol and turn up to vote.
Yeah.
However you want to vote, you vote that way. Land councils, or the Northern Land Council, is an apolitical organisation, but we do take policy positions as directed by our council. So Land Council supported the Yes campaign in The Voice, and we encourage people to vote yes on that voice. When it comes to political federal elections and territory, we don't take a political position for either party.
Because the key concern, and the Chair touched on it, the somewhat unique nature of the Northern Territory Challenge is around the attendance at formal education opportunities. The figures yesterday we were told for the school we attended yesterday were sometimes 25 and 30% in the dry season, better in the wet. So what concerns me about this is if that's a missed opportunity. If you're not at school when civics and citizenship is being taught, how do you ever catch up? And whether it's a land council or online resources, but you're telling me that's a bit patchy in terms of connectivity. Yeah. So I mean, where are we best to direct our efforts as a committee in terms of where the gaps are, that education, so people get that opportunity to even understand the civics and citizenship issue?
Well, I think when I was doing research for this inquiry, I wasn't able to establish who was clearly in charge of civics education as a responsibility. And so that as a number one would be really helpful. Is it the Department of Education? Is it NTEC? Is it other? So that in itself would be helpful so that we can direct some accountability and some support that way. The other thing we would suggest is that there really needs to be a strong focus from the Northern Territory Government to return secondary schooling back to remote communities and homelands. That's been a really key advocacy piece for Central Land Council for a long time, and I know that's an important component for Maningrida as well, to have that support around education, because really at the end of the day, all of the programs and initiatives we heard before are excellent, but if they're not accessible, then they're not accessible. The other one that I would direct you to think about is the working with the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group to ensure that digital inclusion is fast-tracked and prioritised. We know from multiple sources that most homes in remote communities don't have internet access. People are relying on mobile phones. Because of the lack of access to Wi-Fi and internet, that data download is off the mobile. Therefore, it's almost 4 times as much. There was a study done and it's around 4 times as much. So if you're spending around $50 a month on prepaid, if you're in a remote community without that internet access, you're spending around $200. So it just continues to add pressure around cost of living, etc., etc. But for us, education is key, and that support around secondary education so that there can be continuity of learning through primary, through secondary, through into learning those really important life skills to participate politically, and that digital access as well.
Thanks. I'm not sure if we've had it put to us before, Chair, about a cost of living pressures as a barrier to voting as well. So thank you for pointing that out. Quite long distances involved in attendance voting.
Fuel's exceptionally high. And the rates of poverty in the Northern Territory are increasing rather than decreasing. So there was another study done that really highlights that really significantly, that people's entrenchment in poverty is not getting better, it's getting worse.
One of the things when we were talking with local organisations in Maningrida yesterday was they reflected to us that they do all get involved in the electoral process, and they are providing some of the support that the land councils are providing as well to help people with information, and to help them know where to go to vote and how to vote. But they felt like they were doing this really of their own initiative and on top of what is already a significant workload. Is there a room for more support to be given to local organisations to provide that really I guess, around an election period, intense period of support for people in voting and participating?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there is, but again, the question is, where does that come from? I mean, our main message to you is that any information or support around this needs to be coming from local people on the ground who have those relationships. I think the AEC and NTEC are trying, and you can see evidence of that with their engagement programs. But it's really that equity across all of the remote communities and access to those groups and services. I hear the concerns of the local groups.
So, for instance, if the AEC had, or the NT, but we'll start with the AEC because really that's our remit. If the AEC had more resources to expand, for example, the Indigenous electoral participation program, are there? In the communities that you cover, do you think there are local organisations who would want to take that opportunity up, who would be willing to take on the type of work that is involved in that space?
Yeah, I definitely think there would be. I probably will need to provide you with some details later around how that could look a little bit different in community based on some of the learnings, but I definitely think there would be organisations who would be very keen to do that. Yeah.
Well, we'd appreciate that follow-up information.
Yeah.
Can I put a similar question,
Yeah.
probably structured a slightly different way? Would it be your expectation that giving local organisations the freedom to run their own programs, perhaps funded by the AEC but not delivered out of Canberra, would be more likely to achieve an outcome? Or what's your experience in that regard? I'm a little bit concerned about AEC making decisions from a fairly disconnected position. No matter how well-meaning, would it be better to have a funding pool available for local communities to then be able to access to deliver? And I am definitely leading both witnesses.
Yeah, I definitely think there's an important role and resource commitment required that could improve voter turnout and knowledge, say through the AEC if they partnered with local organisations to do that work, mostly around the education campaign. I think that's where we would direct that partnership. I think it could get tricky at times where organisations are quite political and have a certain way in which they would vote. So there would have to be some careful consideration around how that would be done. Yeah.
Yes, and I think, again, reflecting on what we heard yesterday, that may have been some of the challenges in Maningrida as well, in terms of people not being able to reach that agreement about, okay, what does it look like doing this civics education piece and the broader piece around voting, as opposed to what does it look like giving people the point of view of an organisation. So I guess we'd also welcome if you have reflections on how the AEC could work with community organisations, because that is what the Indigenous Electoral Participation Program is meant to do. It is meant to fund those local organisations to do this work, but if the AEC is struggling to find local organisations who can take up that role, that's probably part of the challenge at the moment. So if you have any further information you'd like to provide us on that as well, we would welcome that. I was also interested in what you were talking about in terms of providing visual and oral information. It certainly very much, again, lines up with what we've heard elsewhere in terms of how people are accessing information. And one of the broader themes of our inquiry is where are people getting their information about civics and participation, and in general, even not in remote communities these days, it is not as much in school, it is from online sources, and sometimes some of that information is not as accurate or reliable as it should be. Are you concerned about misinformation and disinformation in this space for regional and remote communities?
Yeah, absolutely, and particularly for young people. through the Voice referendum process, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation being shared, and a lot of that really popping up on TikTok and places where people weren't even looking for it. It was just coming to them. So, there's definitely a big concern. And so really for us now more than ever is the time to get that information correct, and so that there are really reliable sources. I did note that on the NTC website there were some videos translated into Indigenous languages, local languages, which was great. I tried to find some on the AEC website and couldn't find any. There's a bit of content translated into international languages, but not into local Indigenous languages. So getting some of that right would be helpful. But also, when we're looking at those resources, there needs to be an engagement strategy alongside that. So I don't think it's enough for us just to put information out there. We have to put information out there with support for people, particularly young people, learning to critically analyse where are those sources, what are those sources of information, where are they coming from, and how do I work out if that's credible or not, because there was so much of it during the referendum.
So digital literacy for young people?
Yeah, digital literacy, absolutely. And if we had secondary schooling on the lands, I'd say that that's where a lot of that support or learning could go. I lost my train of thought, but because my understanding at the moment is that the information's available, or NTEC or NT Legislative Assembly can do work remotely, but it's if they've got capacity, if they're invited, so it requires people to have a level of knowledge that these things are available in the first place. Some kind of engagement strategy alongside the digital resources would be our recommendation.
I think our experience on what communication channels have worked in the past. So our Land Rights News newspaper is one of the longest running newspapers in the country. We're back into I'll probably get the date wrong. It's been around for a very long time. And we deliver those printed copies out to remote communities, whether it's through our offices or in our staff's journeys out to run consultations on country. And in that, Aboriginal people are able to pick up a trusted source of news that's providing information about what's happening in this space. The campaign that we ran, the Sign Up to Stand Up campaign, that was largely on YouTube and through our social media channels, and then it was picked up by mainstream media as well to be promoted around. I think the main thing is hearing it from a trusted source of information, and that's why we selected those spokespeople to really lead that and do it in an engaging way. Certain types of advertisements people are less likely to tune into, or it's all served also by the algorithms on your social networks, right? If it's boring content, it's not going to make it to someone that's very active in a TikTok space. So it needs to be engaging as well.
Central Land Council also have Land Rights News, so failed to mention that, but yeah, it is a really trusted source of information for people. And we put out so we put out information in the Land Rights News that covers all parties. We don't just put out one party's information. We
also found that with the kind of the Get Vaccinated campaign during COVID, very simple messaging around the Get Vaccinated, and it was videos of our council members or community members encouraging others to go and get vaccinated using the same type of channels, our NLC TV. It's dropped off a little bit with some resourcing issues, but we're hoping to get it back up and running so that we're out sharing information with community members more frequently. And of course, the other channel that we use a lot is sharing information through our council members to take back to their communities. We've got 83 council members that represent people from across the top half of the territory. So when there are council meetings or our regional council meetings that they choose, or the chair will invite guest presenters in to talk about issues that are important, and then those members can take that information back out to their home communities to share.
Thanks, Chair. I was interested, David, in your opening statement around voter apathy. I think you reflected on it too, Christine, that people aren't going to value their vote if they think nothing changes. Is there some sort of obligation almost for people like the chair and myself and your organisation to perhaps take a more optimistic view and celebrate some of the successes a bit more, to demonstrate to the voting public that actually things have changed. There have been some successes. Would that help at all? And if we were able to get more positive news out about the progress NLC or CLC's made in this space, and just in trying to encourage people to say, well, your vote can make a difference. Is that something we could be doing better, or is it a bit fanciful?
No, I think that's always the objective. We're always looking to share, and people want to see the good things that are happening. I think, unfortunately, the reality is in Aboriginal communities there is also that distrust of hundreds of years of not being included and treated very poorly by governments. And sure, those are the decisions of the past, but there is very much a frustration, whether it comes to key issues for Aboriginal people like treaty, or when there is an opportunity to be heard by the rest of the country, like in The Voice, where remote Northern Territory overwhelmingly supported it. To have that thrown back in people's faces by the rest of the country's response. I think those kind of things are what makes it challenging when we're talking about being heard by casting their vote. We also need to be real that Aboriginal people have a lot of issues that they raise over and over and over again, whether it's in our land council forums or whether it's to politicians that come into their communities or to our council meetings. And whether that's the state of their roads or whether that's policy positions on particular topics or whether it's other large promises that have not materialised. All these things over decades end up contributing to that apathy to the whole process. Notwithstanding that, I think, and speaking in general terms, people understand that they're voting for someone to talk for them somewhere else. That can cause its own problems about crossing over with those traditional ways of representation and how that Aboriginal way doesn't necessarily match the Western way of representation or speaking for. So there are those kind of challenges as well. But I certainly think, highlighting the positive things would be helpful, but fulfilling the promises that have been made for decades and decades would be more helpful.
Yeah, and I was going to say that question really, to me, speaks to the bigger whole of government requirement around more genuine partnership and actual shared decision making, which is, again, a commitment under closing the gap around those priority reforms, really needing for governments to really rethink how they do things and change business as usual and really start to genuinely engage with people in partnership and actually follow up on action. And so absolutely, good news stories are always really positive and they're always helpful, but it does really speak to that bigger experience that people have almost on a daily basis of continuing to talk to the same things over and over and nothing changing or not feeling heard.
I understand the uniqueness of a lot of your challenges. The Chair and I do encounter a bit of voter apathy in other parts of the country as well. But I'd suggest it's of a more heightened level here. Perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. And I think particularly at the moment, there really just isn't the progress on closing the gap here that should be happening. And I think that is nationwide, but there definitely is a need to really fast track and progress the closing the gap, particularly the priority reforms.
I'll just add that politicians are very good at talking about the good things or things that they've achieved. So
it really depends on whether you're in government or opposition.
But the broader point that people just generally feel distrusted and let down by promises over time is very real.
I'm going to ask one more technical question, actually, just taking us back to earlier discussion around on the day enrolment and declaration votes. Just wanted to clarify what you were saying. You're saying that you've had reports that there is a sense of shame for some people in being worried that if they turn up and they're not on the roll and they're turned away and they can't vote, and so that's maybe one of the reasons why people are not turning out?
Could be, yeah. I've heard stories of that from when I lived remote before, so I'm speaking from my own personal experience as opposed to the view of the council. and yeah, it's a real concern. People don't want to be embarrassed when they turn up to something thinking they can vote, only to be turned away by they're not on the roll.
So having the possibility of a declaration vote on the day would take that feeling of shame away from people.
I think it would certainly help. It would help you also to simplify your messaging, rather than get enrolled or check that you're enrolled. You'll show up, and the Electoral Commission people are there to help you vote in whatever way you choose to do.
That consistency across the federal election, territory election, yeah, absolutely. Also, too, I've heard that people might show up to vote and then feeling really ashamed when they can't vote, or feeling like they're being made to feel like they don't understand, but then later on getting a letter saying you didn't turn up to vote. Right. So it's sort of like almost a secondary kind of kick in the teeth, So it would, I think, be very helpful. Yeah.
Anything further?
No, great, thank you.
Just one point I wanted to make about the education of civics in schools. If everybody's serious about doing this, I'd encourage you to look at other models of learning that are working in remote communities. So, for example, the Learning on Country program is a really great success story that, federally funded, delivered by territory schools in communities, but coordinated by NLC in 14 or 17 sites across remote Australia, and we get in our region. And the program's got really good engagement because it's focused on subject matter experts, being Aboriginal people in management of their own land, transferring that knowledge onto the younger generation. And it's very robust. There's local governance and steering committees that focus on it. The model, there's potential for it to grow into other areas that are relevant to those students out there. At the moment, it's focused just on land management, and our ranger programs are very heavily. Correct. Yeah, it's basically about ranger programs working hand in hand with the schools, linking it into curriculum where possible, and then having that knowledge transfer from people that have been doing it for a long time to the next generation coming through and doing it in an education-centred environment. So I'd certainly encourage you to look at adopting a model that engages Aboriginal people in the regions that are familiar with civics and democracy, formalising it in an education process to be able to then share that with young people, and it might help with other issues like attendance on those type of days, or getting that buy-in because it's coming from family members who have lived and experienced and are passionate about voting or democracy from wherever it's gone. So the Learning on Country people made it very clear to me that we're not talking about expanding Learning on Country into civics and democracy in that space. It's been running well and growing, but it's from many years of hard work. But that kind of model might be something that could help in this civic space.
So what you're sort of talking about is a model that uses relevant local structures and information to make civics relevant.
Yeah, and passing that information on from people that know about it already might have some. It might be less, accessible compared to, say, land management practices, but Aboriginal people have been managing their land for thousands of years as opposed to participating in Western democracy processes, so it might be a bit less widespread. But you could certainly look at it as a model that has worked in taking a topic, engaging with students at school and linking it into curriculum to make it relevant to what they're doing at school as well, rather than just a mandatory kind of footnote on a curriculum that people do in the city and we try to do out bush. Definitely worth looking at as far as a model, but again, it's about access, it's about resourcing, it's about formalising it, and the Learning on Country program has grown over many years of lots of hard work with local steering committees involved and everybody working together through MOUs of different groups and parties. So just another thing for you to think about in how it could work in the future.
And something like that could benefit non-Aboriginal students as well, in learning about Aboriginal people's governance systems and political systems and vice versa. So that's how we develop empathy and compassion and understanding of each other's cultures, and what a wonderful thing to be able to contribute to society.
Right, well, thank you both for your attendance today and for sharing all of that information with the committee. We really appreciate it. If you are able to provide us any additional information, we've requested to the Secretariat by Friday, 2nd of August 2024. Thank you again, and I will close our session.